I've got one flame to burn, one race that I can say I ran.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 21047.com podcast. My name is Keith Cartwright. I am the host of this show, and I am really glad to have you along listening in today, wherever it is that you are listening, and whenever it is that you are listening in. Today's episode is sponsored by my friend Tiffany Eisentrout. Tiffany has sponsored this show and this whole 21047 effort for some time now, and I am grateful for that. That support allows me to go do crazy things like I'll talk about today, and then come back and share those stories with you and just try to share and spread some of the inspiration that comes out of these running journeys that I go on, and sharing running journeys that I discover that others have gone on. And it's really that support that I get from Tiffany and this entire Patreon team. They give me some financial backing every month that allows me to slip away from some other part-time work I have and focus on this. And I just find this to be meaningful. It means a lot to me that others will come behind me and support it. So thank you, Tiffany. If you'd like to learn more about how you can support this effort through Patreon, you can go to my website, 21047.com, TWOTIM47.com. Click on the Support Me tab, and then you'll find a link to Patreon. I have a 21047 Patreon page, and there are different levels of financial support you can commit to on a monthly basis. And any amount helps. Any amount is appreciated. I'm also always really grateful for the folks who just come back week after week, sometimes I guess every couple of weeks, and listen in to these episodes and share them. That is really the goal of this whole thing, is to get these stories out there, touch people's lives, and however God chooses to use these stories to do that. And you listeners are the ones who make that happen. So thank you for that. Thank you again, Tiffany. She's a good friend, and a good friend also of the running partner and friend I'm going to talk about today, who went on this journey last weekend with me at the Oxbow Ultra Marathon. So no interview today. It's just me rattling on about my latest running adventure. So most of you who have been following along remember last year I attempted my first ultra marathon. I signed up for the Georgia Jewel. Georgia Jewel had the 35-mile, 50-mile, and 100-mile choices. I chose the 35. Just want to break easy into this whole ultra thing. And so long story short, I know many of you followed that. I went to Georgia and ultimately last September came up short. I couldn't finish that 35-mile race. It was really a bit hot, humid. The weather conditions didn't suit me well. It's a really, really tough course. A lot of mountains and lots of rocks. It was really just a whole lot of challenge that I guess in many ways I was unprepared for, even though I've trained hard really all year long in terms of miles. Probably didn't put enough work in similar terrain. Not a lot of trails here in Ashland that simulate the Georgia trails. So in a lot of ways, the weather and preparation just didn't cooperate with me. Anyhow, I didn't complete it. That did not sit well with me. I didn't wallow in the defeat and let failure get me down. But I'm also a guy, when I don't accomplish something I set out to do, sometimes that eats at me. And this one was. And it's been a pretty successful year for me running. I've had several half marathon PRs, a marathon PR, did some distance things, and just all in all, it's been a good year. I recently ran the Richmond Half Marathon, and that was really the last thing I had scheduled until I go back to Houston in January. On a side note, to try to redeem myself, this year started with the Houston Marathon and my inability to reach the finish line there and keep up with the 6-hour cutoff. So that's how my year started, and then things kind of turned around after that. But now I had this gap. I had this gap between Richmond in early November and then January, end of January really, with Houston Part 2. So I started kind of wallowing in what on earth am I going to do? I'm a guy who really needs goals in front of me and something bigger than just miles and number of days and run streaks. I just needed something kind of big to tie me over to Houston. So I got to Googling Virginia Ultra November or December, and up pops this Oxbow Ultra Marathon in St. Paul, Virginia. I looked up St. Paul, Virginia, town of about 1,000 people in Southwest Virginia. Southwest Virginia, I do a lot of work there, and so it's not a real populated place, very mountainy, somewhat isolated, and tucked in the corner of that area of the state, next to kind of West Virginia, Tennessee, that whole little triangle down there, is St. Paul, Virginia, home of the Oxbow Ultra Marathon. So I got to looking into this race, and they had options. It was a timed race. They had options for a 6-hour, a 12-hour, and a 24-hour race. So I started doing a little calculations and thought to myself, I think I could go down there and run 35 miles in 12 hours. Not the Georgia Jewel. Wouldn't quite bring me the redemption, probably not quite erase the nightmare of that failure. But if I could finish the year proving to myself that I could do 35 miles, maybe that would be a great way to start and roll into 2019. So then I found out that my friend Nicole, who went to Georgia with me and ran the Georgia Jewel by my side, she did something I didn't. She finished it, and in a really impressive fashion, I highlighted that effort in some writing and podcasting in a previous episode. So you can go back, just Google Georgia Jewel, my name, and you'll come up with all of that. But anyhow, Nicole, she finished that one, but she was going to be with her family over there in Southwest Virginia for Thanksgiving. Reached out, threw this race by her. She is not very good at saying no to race adventures. I kind of always know that when I reach out to her, which works in my favor. So she was all in, and we registered for this Oxbow Ultra Marathon. So here we are. It's coming up on Oxbow Day. It was the Saturday after Thanksgiving, and I'd been monitoring the weather out in front of that, and the weather was calling for a chance of ice and snow and rain, and Nicole and I started bantering back and forth with our photos, screenshots of our weather apps. She would be sending me weather forecasts that were less intimidating than what my app was saying. My app was saying lots of heavy rain, heavy wind. So I was getting a little worried about the weather going into it. But fortunately, come race day, the weather, it was rainy. It was a dreary, sort of dark, gloomy morning, but no snow, no ice, no real heavy wind, no real heavy rain, just kind of enough to keep us damp and moist and chilly. But for running purposes, for me, it was almost ideal, really. So that kind of came around in our favor. So we rode together. We arrived in St. Paul the morning of the race. And St. Paul was everything it was cracked up to be: small. And we pulled into this tiny town, down this little gravel driveway or road, into this tiny little park where there were a few tents set up and a few cars already parked, a few folks kind of gathering around. It was pretty clear right away that this wasn't drawing a large crowd of runners, and it was much, much smaller than any race experience I had ever faced before, especially coming off of the Richmond Marathon, where there are tens of thousands downtown, and you're fighting for parking spaces and just for standing spaces. You're just fighting for every inch of ground you can get. And here we were in this tiny little park. Had this little blow up start finish line. You could see down this little hill where it was all going to get started. And so it was kind of a cool atmosphere really to start off. And, I couldn't help but think this, this all started with, the Georgia Jewel really, but then Googling and just kind of going out on an adventure and happenstance find this Oxbow Ultra Marathon. And so it was kind of a cool feeling to be sitting there watching all of this go on. And so we watched folks preparing. Nicole and I sat in the car, kind of were just chatting and taking it all in. And one of the highlights of the race weekend kind of took place really in that car watching different runners. So Nicole kind of got my attention and said, "Are you watching that?" Well, directly across from us was one of the other runners who, how should I say, was liberally applying Vaseline or some sort of anti-chafing lubricant over almost all of his body. And here it was cold, rainy, and he's standing out in this parking lot really getting himself all ready to race. Now, for me, I frequently go through this routine, so it wasn't much shocking to me. I tried to tell that to Nicole that, just sometimes us men, us runners, have to take precautions like that, and that's all he was doing. But I guess she was a little taken back. This was taking place in such a public forum, and for her and everyone else to see. So our day started really on a lighthearted sort of note. We laughed about that one and continued to. It has become sort of a running joke. So anyhow, I throw that in just to say that it's kind of fun in a little small town event like that to really people watch, and you kind of get to know every single runner in the race. And that was sort of the mood that got set in that parking lot as we watched folks lube up. We watched folks hauling tiny little coolers to their tent. We watched folks get their food together. It was clear a lot of folks were going to spend the day there, making it sort of a family affair and going to be cooking while we were out there running for hours on end. So that's kind of how the race got started for us, sitting there and hoping for the rain to stop. But then it came time for the runners to get called to the starting line, and so we made our way down, and all of us lined up under that blow-up start-finish line. And I started looking around and wondered, where is everybody? And that was everybody. I don't know. I never did count. I think maybe there were 20 of us tops. They took a little group picture of us right there, all of us together, and we all could fit into the start finish line photo. And so again, coming off of races where there are always at least many, many hundreds, if not thousands of runners, this was a little bit of a different starting line experience, coupled with the idea that we are both in real foreign country to us and didn't know anybody. But already going into it, you got a sense that these were some really nice people who were putting this event on. It had come kind of a holiday, I guess, tradition for them and St. Paul and the community itself. So, we felt at ease the whole time. I think that was just part of, again, this whole small town feel to it. But we lined up. You could sit at the starting line. You could see the trail go off in the distance. It wrapped around this lake that we were all standing next to. But standing there, you could also see, as you looked across the lake where this trail wrapped around to, was a mountain. And it was pretty clear if the trail went that way, it was getting nowhere else without going up that mountain. So in my mind, I thought that looks a little bit steeper than some of the elevation profiles I studied coming into the race. And because I had found a couple of runners who had run this in the past and just wanted to try to get the best idea I could at what sort of experience we were going to get into in terms of the elevation and the trail itself. But standing there looking at it, I don't know, maybe in races like that, I guess a mountain looks a little taller always when you know you're running up it or walking up it. Mountains don't look so steep when you're in a car, I guess. But when you're standing there knowing in the next, 10, 15 minutes, I'm climbing that thing, I guess they all become a little more intimidating than they look on an elevation chart or in a blog post description. But it was the real deal. We were all ready to go. So again, Nicole and I, we chose the 12-hour event. Our goal was to get 7 laps in. The Oxbow Ultra was made up of a 5-mile loop. And so our goal was to complete 7 of those laps in 12 hours. And so the starting gun, boom, went off, and then off we went. And that first mile around the lake was just a nice, steady, taking it easy, let's ease into this thing sort of pace. But then real quick, you wrap around this lake, and then it takes a sharp right and feeds you into this little switchback where you really just turn and go the opposite direction, only up the side of this mountain. And so that's when we knew we were into something real here. This was not going to be a 5-mile loop around a flat lake. The elevation was real. So we started climbing up this thing. Now, again, it's rainy. We're kind of cold. I just had on a shirt, and I had on a long sleeve shirt and then another layer on top of that. Nicole had on a few layers and then a raincoat that she would keep taking on and off as the rain would come and go. So that was fine. Just tells you that the weather was a little bit fickle as we started in on this, but it had rained all night and it was wet. And so this terrain, the terrain of the Oxbow, at least through this section as we went up the mountain, was fairly narrow trails, dirt trails, but because of the rain, there were a lot of mud puddles that had gathered, and there were also a lot of leaves that had collected throughout the woods and on the trail, and so every step was slippery. We did the best we could to navigate around the puddles to keep our feet as dry as we could. At some point, I just gave up on that altogether and decided it was much easier just to have wet feet that seemed to dry out pretty quickly than it was to try to traipse off in the woods to avoid them. But the first time in this, the first lap, the first time going up the mountain in this 5-mile loop, that was a struggle. This hill, this mountain was real. And like I said, the elevation charts said that it was going to be about 500 feet of elevation gain each lap. I think it actually realistically turned out to be a bit more than that. But it felt like a really steep climb. And so that's what you did for the next mile and a half. It was windy but uphill, again fighting the puddles, fighting the leaves, fighting the dampness. But then as you get to the top, as you scale this mountain, you get to the top and you break out into the open of what is a huge mountaintop pasture, really, although I didn't see many wildlife or livestock or anything up there. It wasn't farmland, but it was just flat pasture-like environment. And now the one thing was that opened us to a lot of wind, so the wind was pretty strong up there. But as it emerged up there, suddenly hills were gone. It was level. Your legs got a chance to relax. And after I did this a few times, this became really comforting in the process, because you knew I only have to tackle that mountain one time, at least in a lap. And then the rest of the final 3 miles is much, much more doable. There were challenges in that I'll talk about in a minute. But one of the challenges was not my legs being on fire and my breath being on fire, trying to keep up with the work involved in going up that mountain. So that kind of became our every lap. That became kind of the challenge. Just, okay, this next mile, a little over a mile, we got to go up this mountain. But when we do, we'll be good for the next 3 miles, kind of flat and then downhill to the finish line. So we spent a lot of time really up there on that, because it was just beautiful. And, you know, I wrote a Facebook post about it. I've wrote about it in a blog that, you know, I reflected up there really that there was nothing planned about ending up at the Oxbow Ultra Marathon. It was a Google search product of sort of my ego messing with me, really, this whole idea that I couldn't finish that Georgia Jewel, and, you know, just following different prompts and whispers. Here I am on the Saturday after Thanksgiving on this mountaintop, just beautiful, in Southwest Virginia, in a town I'd never heard of. And just once again, it was powerful where this running journey has taken me. And a lot of times I reflect about that in terms of physical strength I've gained along the way, mental strength I've gained along the way, weight I've lost along the way, just a healthier approach to my spiritual life and life in general. And all of those things are true. Running has provided that for me. But when I think about some of the experiences and places I have landed, things I've got to see, feelings I've got to feel by following the prompts of this whole running journey, I was pretty amazed at it all, standing up there and with Nicole, who's been a great friend through all of this and has shared in, like I said, the Georgia Jewel experience, and then a lot of these other experiences. And we have a shared faith that really appreciates the creation that we get to hang out in and explore. It was pretty cool being up there with her and looking around and taking this all in. So, you know, running provides a lot of opportunities. One of them really is reflection. And I think we do a disservice to ourselves and to our opportunities in life if we don't stop and really reflect and take in everything we can from those moments. Now, granted, we had a goal and to finish 7 laps. So it wasn't like we could stand up there and reflect all day long. And I did some Facebook Live videos up there. And my buddy Tracy Outlaw, who tells me I spend way too much time on my phone while I'm running, I know he wasn't very pleased at the reflective time, and certainly using Facebook Live to share in that reflection. But I just think that's part of the running life for me. I've got goals and they're important, but I never want to chase those goals at the expense of missing out on some really, really cool moments like we experienced up there on top of that mountain at the Oxbow Ultra Marathon. So just wanted to share that, and I do, and I wrote, I think it's, I think the parallel, so much of these conversations I have with you really are relating these parallels that come from the running life and real life, to the degree that they are different. The more I take part in this running life, the more I come to believe it really is, pretty much synonymous with my real life. But there are lessons that we get out of running that I think help us in other areas of our life outside of running. And I shared it on Facebook that, climbing that mountain and really getting caught up in the struggle, because when you are climbing the mountain, it's hard and you're wondering, when is this ever going to end? The energy that it takes. You're tired, you're cranky, especially as you get to lap 4 and 5, and no comment there, Nicole. But it does get hard, and it's hard to stop in that moment and think about anything other than, how do I do this next step? How do I recover? How do I handle this? There's really nothing real rational going on in terms of thought. You're just caught up in the pressure of the moment, the pressure to advance. But then you get to the top and the energy kind of stops a little bit in terms of what you need, and the thoughts, you're allowed to relax a little bit and think about what this all means. And I think the lesson in it is that is life. There are things sometimes we get caught up in the pressure of the day, the challenge of the job, the challenge of the relationship, the challenge of this adventure that we want to take on, and our thoughts. We don't give ourselves time to really stop and think about things because we're so caught up in how hard it is. And sometimes it's hard enough to talk us out of climbing the mountain. It's hard enough to keep us from believing that there is a mountain top, that there is something beautiful at the other end of that climb that is worth it. And every time, every lap, I told Nicole, every time we came around and we climbed that mountain, and it was hard every single time. I complained every single time, I think. I don't think there was one time where I thought, wow, this is easy. This is really cool that we're in the midst of this struggle up this mountain. But every time when we got to the top, I told her, this is why it's worth it. This is what we're in that for, is to be able to have this opportunity to see this, to take this in. And I think that's the lesson in life, that the more we allow ourselves to drop the fear, dive into discomfort, and take on the challenges in life, the more we get to that point where we say, this is what it's all about. This is what that was for. This is why my life should be geared toward looking for the challenges, not running away from them. So that's it. That's my thought on the plateau, the Oxbow, top of the mountain, because the race didn't stop there. The loop didn't stop there, clearly. So we meandered. It was a nice mile, I think, or so, through that openness, and the trail was really wide through there. There were no leaves and no puddles through there. That was really one of the added bonuses. But then it did wind, and you start back down the mountain, and you get back into the leaves and the mud. Now, I will tell you, going back down, I felt like a downhill skier all day long. And I didn't have skis on. I had these trail shoes on. And I wrote about this, that I think one of my greatest running accomplishments so far in the 5 years that I have been somewhat of a runner, one of my greatest accomplishments is at the Oxbow Ultra Marathon, I did not fall down once, because I swore that was going to happen more than once. That first loop around, when the conditions were as good as they were going to get all day long, I nearly fell down on my butt a half a dozen times. And so I just knew it was a matter of when. When am I going to land on my butt? What part of the trail will it be on? And will I slide over the mountain, down the trail, or require some sort of medical attention? Those were the things that were going to happen. But it never did. But I will say it didn't happen because I put so much effort into, there were times my arms were going every which way, my legs are going every which way. I'm fighting with every limb I have to regain some balance and keep myself from any of those options we just talked about. I did not want to fall down. And so, the next day and really all week long, a lot of my recovery, a lot of my soreness has been because my legs and arms and everything else went in so many directions they normally don't go in running. Because in running, I'm normally not spending a lot of time trying to regain my balance. But we did that day, and the downhill part of that race was a lot more challenging, really, than the uphill in that regard. Because going uphill, there were enough rocks and different things like that where you could get a good sort of grip compared to what you could get going downhill. And the downhill, there were some spots that were really steep, really covered with leaves, very few options to the side of the trail where you could duck off and kind of find an alternative, safer, less slippery path. So that was interesting each time as we came. So you climb the mountain. Well, you started flat around the lake, kind of a pretty little stroll Saturday in the park, then up the mountain, not a trip in the park. I mean, it was a real battle, a real climb. Then this real reflective sort of spot on top of the mountain. There was a Boy Scout troop up there with an aid station, so it was kind of a celebration. And then you wander through there, and then it's downhill, and it's skiing, and it's battling. And then that feeds into the final stretch to the start-finish line that you went and approached every 5 miles. And it was along this beautiful little river, and the river was roaring that day in my mind. I don't know what it's like on a normal day because I don't live there. Didn't know where St. Paul was before we tackled this ultra marathon. But you would wind on this trail alongside this Clinch River. And like I said, the water was really roaring from the rains, different parts of it. You could just really hear the water thundering over the rocks. And again, it was a pretty cool place to be because, not to get too reflective, but you just wonder how many sounds out there are there on these trails, how many little streams, how many big rivers. I'd never heard of the Clinch River, but how many of these places are there out there that we miss because we just don't take some chances to go explore them? And so it was a pretty cool kind of final stretch to the start-finish line along this Clinch River, and it was flat, so flat was good. And it was, again, the leaves were thick through here, and the water was thick. There was a lot of shoes getting wet, but that is sort of the 5-mile loop that we had to take. So I want to talk a little bit about this whole loop thing. So the Georgia Jewel, that again was 35 miles, and that was I don't know if you remember when I talked about that, but the Georgia Jewel, we got on the bus there in Dalton and took about a 45-minute trip to the start-finish line of this race. And so we took off from there, and then it was supposed to be for me, and it was for Nicole, 35 miles later, you arrive back home. There were no loops. It was just start to finish, several aid stations along the way. And so that was just the structure of that race. This whole 5-mile loops thing, I think it really worked in my favor. Now, I'll talk in a minute. I ultimately came up 1 lap short. I only got 30 miles in. But, with these 5-mile loops, number one, 5 miles, I've got to the point where 5 miles always seems really doable. So I'm not intimidated by the idea that I have to get up and go run 5 miles today. So broken down like that into 5-mile runs, and with the opportunity to be at a kind of a reset point every lap where you could say, okay, this isn't a 35-mile run. This is just another 5-mile run. From a mental standpoint, that really played well with me because these long runs, they really are. They're mental journeys. I think clearly anytime you're running a distance that's further than you're used to running, further than, kind of what's in your comfort zone, it's always a physical challenge. Running in itself, it's a physical act, so it's always going to be a physical challenge. And then the further you go relative to what you've run before or what you're kind of up for, the more physically challenging that is. But I've got to the point in this running thing that my biggest challenge really is the mental side of this game. Not to say by any stretch running comes easy to me physically. It's always a real tough deal for me. But mentally, I think that has held me back. I think mentally, the weather, the heat, humidity, it has a real physical handicap, real physical impact on me when I'm out there running. I don't know, more or less than others. I just know it's much, much harder for me to run in. It does physically. I sweat more. It's hard for me nutrition-wise. But I also know when I see the weather forecast, hot and humid, mentally I'm already preparing myself for a rough day and impending defeat when I know that the hot weather is coming. So mentally, I know that the Georgia Jewel, I probably wasn't in the place that I needed to be. And so that'll be one thing I'll have to work on. But this loops, the 5-mile loops, really made it easier for me to stay in a strong mental place. Again, just this idea that I didn't have to run 35 miles. I just had to go out on a bunch of 5-mile runs. And you really could get to a point where you could kind of reset that to say, okay, I just finished that run. Now all I have to do is go do another 5-mile run. And within each of those 5-mile runs, yes, there was the challenge of the mountain. But even with that, I knew each time, and because we'd already did it once, I knew I could do it. And I knew at the other end of each of those mountain climbs was, again, a bit of a rest or a bit of a easier trek to the finish line. So I really like this whole loops, and I think for me, 5 miles is kind of a wheelhouse ideal loop distance, both in, again, the idea of a 5-mile run itself, distance-wise, isn't terribly intimidating for me, so that worked. Because there was plenty of food and drink there at the start-finish line, and then again at the top of the mountain about 2 miles in, that further even broke up the 5-mile run and provided ample opportunity to get nutrition and drink without having to carry a lot of it on your own. So I just really walked away liking, I would do it again. I like this whole idea of loops, especially this one. It was beautiful. It had enough sort of varying things that you got to see. There was the climb, there was the lake, the beautiful plateau I talked about, the skis going downhill, and then, the river. So there was enough to really break it up. You never did get bored in each loop thinking, oh, I've seen all this before. This is kind of getting monotonous. I never got to that place at all. So I would do that again. I'd encourage somebody, if they're thinking about tackling a longer distance, that is it's a cool way to do it. And then on top of that, the whole timed aspect, even though we kept going across the start-finish line was really never physically the goal, the end sight. It was always the time. It was 12 hours. We were going to be out there. 12 hours was our finish line. So we were just trying to achieve as much as we could lap-wise within that time parameter. So we weren't ever pointing towards the start-finish line, even though that sort of became our milestone. It kind of became our landmark more than our end goal. So I think, again, I like this idea of timed races where it's just about, literally, I could just keep focus on one step in front of the other, one step in front of the other. I just got to finish this 5-mile run, and the start-finish line is not my start, it's not my finish. It's just sort of to help me keep track of where I am. So I liked it. I think the structure was very cool. The timed element of it was very cool. Where it happened in this tiny little town with very few people who they lived up to the reputation that I've kind of established for trail runners. They were always wanting to help, always wanting to check on us, see how we're doing. So just the whole environment there in this ultra worked for me. So we came around our fourth lap, actually. So the first 2 laps, I think we did in, the first one was about an hour and 14 minutes. The next one was an hour and 19 minutes. And so when you came across the start-finish line, your name would pop up on this electronic screen. It would tell you your total time. You could see how long you had been out there. You could see how fast you did your last lap. And then it projected, if you kept rolling along at the pace you were on, how many laps or miles you would complete. And so I think we had finished like after our first lap, it was talking we were going to finish like 50 miles, and I knew that wasn't happening. But even after 4 miles in, we came across, and it was still projecting, I think, high 30s, maybe near 40 miles that we could do. Because again, we did 20 miles and a little under 6 hours. So I'm sure, math-wise, that says we were projected to do about 40 miles. But it was after that fourth lap, finishing up 20 miles. That lap took us about 2 hours. I was slowing down a lot. There was a lot more walking going on. 2 reasons. One, my legs were getting really, really tired. The chill, the cold was kind of settling in them. And then so there were few people, right? But there were still people running around there lap after lap. So the mud was getting muddier. The slippery leaves were getting slipperier as they were being traipsed down and mixed in with the wet and the mud in the trail. So we had to slow down a little bit to pay attention to footing. At least I did, because again, I was pretty committed. I'm not sliding down this mountain or over the edge of the trail into one of these deep ravines. So things started to slow down. And after mile 20, lap 4, I kind of projected out that if we kept going a little bit slower and the laps started taking us maybe a little over 2 hours, 35 miles was going to be impossible. And that's because if you start that last lap and you don't make it back before 12 hours is up, once 12 hours is your finish line. So if you're out in the middle of a 5-mile lap at the 12-hour mark, you get no credit for the miles you run there in terms of the official race count. And so I knew that, we probably, I guess, could have finished it. We would have had to finish it one way or another and get to that finish line. And my Garmin could say, he did 35 miles. But I knew from an official standpoint, 30 was probably going to be it that day. And realistically, with the way I was feeling in my legs, 30 was probably going to be all I would get that day. And I was grateful. Nicole was there as I was kind of processing this, and she helped remind me what I knew, that 30 miles would be further than I've ever run in one event. We were already at 6 hours. We were closing in on the longest time-wise I had ever been on my feet walking or running. And so there was a lot to be accomplished by just continuing on with that journey. We were at lap 4, like I said, so 2 more laps seemed far from something easy to tackle. But that kind of at that point became plan B. I knew that Georgia Jewel 35-mile piece of redemption probably wasn't going to happen that day. But I knew I was going to walk away from there feeling pretty accomplished. I never in my life dreamed I would one day be driving away from anywhere saying that I just ran 30 miles. So that was still pretty motivating for me to keep going. Like I said, keep tackling one more 5-mile run, one more 5-mile run. Now, I will say one unique challenge that became a part of this as we continued the lap. So we finished lap 5. It was probably around 5 o'clock, maybe 5:15 in the evening. So it was starting to get dark. We had headlamps with us. But I've never been out running and had the day turn to night, where you run all day and then all of a sudden now you're running the same place but in total darkness. And so as we headed into lap 6, finished this thing up to get 30 miles. We started up the mountain and could still sort of see our way up there, but about halfway up the climb, we had to break out our headlamps because it really just got pitch black. And that was a whole new experience for me, that everything that was familiar now is unfamiliar. And, headlamps are good, but they are not lighting up the night. I mean, they are good enough to kind of see what's out in front of you. And remember what I've talked about. What was out in front of us was mud puddles and piles of wet leaves and all the other obstacles in the trail that, you really really didn't see most of them until they came right up on you. So really, that last lap was, one, it was all walking. Two, it was all sort of focused on just what's right in front of us. I know I was getting crankier. My running partner was having a little bit more difficulty putting up with me. It was the long day was closing in. My friend Kelly Anderson had reached out, actually, I think it was several hours earlier, about mile 15, when she had said, this is the time in the race when you start getting a little cranky, so treat our girl nice. She's a good friend with Nicole, and I guess she was a little worried about how I was going to treat her and how my attitude running tends to go downhill quick at a certain part of the race. But I will say I hung in there good Saturday. I think I kept a good attitude. And again, I think it was always because mentally everything was always doable. A lot of eating. My nutrition was a lot different. That sat well better with me through the long term. But on that last lap, I will say I felt myself starting to get just a bit crankier. And so I had to watch myself. We probably had to have a chat or two to rein me in and remind me that we were about to finish. Nicole was getting really cold, like her teeth were chattering and her lips were turning purple. And so there was a lot going on this last lap. But it was all intensified by this sudden pitch blackness. We heard some coyotes in the different distance, although I knew they were coyotes. Nicole refused to believe that they were coyotes, even though I told her I've heard coyotes before. That's what those are coyotes. I assured her they ate sheep, not her. But she just decided to go the route of not believing me when I said they were coyotes. It was just some strange howling noise in the distance. But it all sort of factored into a really, I'm not going to use the word cool environment. I'm just going to say it was a different environment. I had not experienced running. I've ran at night before, but just never where you were suddenly daylight to night in the same place in this sort of loop thing where what you were traveling during the day is suddenly something completely different, even though you're at the same place. And so we were out there, and, I want to share this. Like I said, wasn't a packed house, it wasn't a packed field, but there were a lot of runners out there. Several of them were out there running the 24-hour race. So one woman in particular came bouncing by us. I don't know what lap she was on. She ultimately ended up running 100 miles, which just floors me. But we were out there in this dark, like I said, the cold and the dark, and I was, again, mentally trying to process this thing of being out here at night and how different that was. And so this woman who, again, is out there for 24 hours, she came bouncing by and, how y'all doing? And hang in there, you're doing a good job. And she missed chipper. And, like I just said, I'm kind of not so chipper at this point. And she just bounced on by. But I told Nicole that I'm not sure in that moment what my mind would be like if I knew that I'm out there running and I'm going to be out there running for the next 14 hours, because that's what she was up to. We were on about hour 10, and on top of that, about 12 of that for her was going to be in that environment we were in, pitch black. And it does get sort of overwhelming mentally and emotionally. And she was alone. We weren't alone, so we at least had somebody to talk to. I don't know. That just seemed. I've been intrigued by 24-hour races, and I think it would be. I don't see that going away. I know I'll continue to be intrigued by the idea of a 24-hour race. But that brought it all into reality for me. And again, I think a lot of it had to do, too, it wasn't just dark. It was cold. It was damp. It was a challenging surface to keep up with. So not only were you battling all that, but you still had to be really focused on where my next step is the best you could. So just a lot going on mentally, going back to this idea that this is such a mental game. But so I won. I had just complete respect for this woman as she was chipper, bouncing around, woohoo, like she was on mile 1 in the daylight. But then too, like I said, it started to weigh on me, and I just had a hard time imagining her mindset and how she was managing that, and how I would possibly manage that the day I decided I was going to do something crazy like run 24 hours instead of 12. We hung in there, though. That last stretch, I think we both were thinking this is a lot longer than it was during the day, because it just felt like that lap went on forever and ever. It did. It was much longer than time-wise than our previous 5 laps. But we eventually got there. We got to the part where we knew we're like a quarter of a mile from the start finish, and we did not burst into a sprint to the finish line. We did not do that. But I think our energies picked up, our attitudes. Mine was suddenly healed. I was a new man. And so we did. We finished it up. We knew this was our last lap. We went across. It was about 10 and a half hours. The man in the timing tent said, hey, you all going to try another one, knowing that was probably not going to happen. There was no way we could go crank another lap out in an hour and a half. And he quickly pointed out, right, you guys just took about 2 hours and 15 minutes, so that might be a bit challenging for you. So we told him we were done. And then the lovely couple, or I don't know if they were officially a couple or just friends, what have you, but there was a small group. They came up, they handed us these very cool finishers medals. We had already got these really nice hooded sweatshirts. It's kind of like my favorite sweatshirt that we got for signing up for the race, which came in real handy in that moment as we were walking away and looking for something dry and warm. So the atmosphere there at the end was, it was fitting with the whole day. Just this kind of, it was like being out with just a big group of friends and family on a run, only you do it for 12 hours up and down a mountain. But it was heartwarming in a lot of ways. It's kind of just not your normal race environment for me, anyhow. And for me, it worked well because I'm not a huge crowds type person. I have to have that in small doses. So this was really perfect for me. And then, like I said, they gave us their really nice medals. We got a nice shirt or sweatshirt out of the deal. And so then we're walking away, and I use the term walking real loosely. We kind of struggled and stumbled away, crawled our way up these steps away from the finish line. Nicole was bouncing up there much better than me. I was struggling up them. And we're kind of at the top, and all of a sudden I hear this young fella yelling, "Hey, Nicole! Hey, Nicole!" He comes running up, and it appears that Miss Nicole had won the women's division of our 12-hour race. So he was holding this big growler from a local brewery and said, "Hey, you're the top female finisher, so here's your grand prize." And it really was a nice growler. There was a little certificate for it to forevermore declare her the women's champion. Now, she would later research and see just how many women were in her division, and I will not reveal how many were. I just want to I just want to leave it at she was and is forevermore the 2018 Oxbow Women's Division and the 12-hour group champion. That's what she is. And she is in many ways. She helped me a lot with my attitude and with my hanging in there, and just is always very cool to run those races with. So I did not win any championships. I did, however, finish second in the men's division. But I walked away from there feeling really proud of our accomplishments. I did not like I say, exercise this sort of nightmare that lingers from the Georgia Jewel. But I'm going back to Georgia Jewel next year, and this race really kind of gave me a little confidence that I'm on the right track. Sometimes running isn't so much about where we are, but just kind of understanding what direction we're going. Are we going in one that's getting stronger? Are we in one that mindset-wise we're getting more comfortable in places where maybe before we struggled? Being out on my feet for 10 and a half hours, which was about 3.5 hours longer than I ever had been. That's a real uncomfortable spot for me, but I was real tolerant of that throughout the entire race. Not once did I say I need to sit down. Not once did I say we need to go home. So I think direction-wise, I leave there feeling real confident about where I'm going. I'm pretty excited about 2019. And so that's the Oxbow recap. I think just moral of the story wise, that what would I pass on to any of you? It's that always we're capable of more than we think. Sometimes it just takes committing to it. It takes Googling Ultra Virginia and finding some race in a place you've never heard of and go there. Just don't spend a lot of time thinking about why this is probably not a good idea. Obviously, we all need to practice a lot of discernment in these things, but I think too many times we start with all the reasons this is a bad idea. I just jumped into this is a good idea. I'm going to go do it. And I think a lot of good things happen on the other end of that. So I think, one, just explore. Go explore yourself. Go explore new places. And I think, again, just what direction are you going, right? Where do you want to go and what direction are you going? And we can't get too caught up in what I haven't achieved or where I came up short. Are we coming up short in effort? Are we coming up short in moving in a direction that will ultimately get us where we might have come up short? That doesn't happen if we spend a lot of time wallowing in defeat. I never hide from the reality that defeat doesn't sit well with me. There are folks that try to talk me out of accepting different defeats as failure, trying to tell me, no, that's not failure. I am okay with the word failure. If I try to do something, I don't do it, I failed. But what I will not fail to do is get back up and keep heading after or moving in a direction that is one that's going to make me stronger. And maybe that's not always in a place where I will redeem that particular failure, but I am always going to get back up and move in the direction of strength, in a direction of bettering myself. And maybe that's where failure motivates me. Maybe not so much to achieve something in particular, but to achieve being better and stronger. And, there's no way 2 years ago I would have Googled and looked up St. Paul, Virginia Ultra Marathon and just said, this is a good idea. That's just not the way my mind worked. Today, that's exactly how my mind works. And I think it's all because of this running journey. I think it's all because of taking on different things like St. Paul and the Oxbow Ultra Marathon. So I encourage you all as well to just examine your direction. Don't examine where you are. Don't examine how fast you are. Don't examine how far you can run or how long you can stand on your feet. Don't examine yourself by saying, oh, he went and did a 12-hour race. I've only done 4. Examine yourself according to what direction are you moving today? What steps are you taking towards strength, towards discomfort, towards overcoming fear? It's our steps that are important. It's the direction of those steps. It's not where somebody else has stepped, where somebody else has been. I would be nowhere if I was sitting here comparing myself to some of the folks I follow. If I was looking at my position in life or my position in running compared to some of the medals and positions other people are at. What I try to do is look at every day, what direction am I going? And on the other side of this Oxbow Ultra, and looking back on 2018 on my year, I look at a direction that's really moving someplace that I'm proud of, a place that I feel stronger being. And as I roll into 2019 and start thinking about some of the things that I want to tackle and accomplish next year, I feel like I am well prepared for that journey, because this year I have taken steps, I've taken on challenges that have pointed me in the right direction and given me strength in that direction. So I just encourage you all to do that as you kind of round into the end of your own years. And it's not all about running either. There's probably folks listening here. Maybe it's not running. Maybe it's in your job. Again, it's in your relationship. It's all the same. Every day you got to wake up and look at this role I am in life, whether it's a job, a relationship, an adventure, a vacation, whatever it is. What direction am I going? And how am I getting there? How am I feeling prepared to get there? And don't let or be intimidated by the idea that, well, this is kind of where I'm going, but I'm really a long way away from there and that looks impossible. Maybe it is, but the direction is not. Taking a step toward it is not. And maybe you'll be like me and find out as you start taking some of these steps, I was pointed in the wrong direction anyways. That's what steps help us understand some days, that we get caught up in the finish line, and some days maybe we realize I was pointed to the wrong finish line anyways. Just take a step in the right direction and then discover what you will discover. And for me, I discovered the Oxbow Ultra Marathon in St. Paul, Virginia. St. Paul is a place I would love to go back and visit someday, and I have a feeling I'll go back and visit someday that Oxbow Ultra. It's a kind of a neat time of the year to do it. It's a beautiful place to do it, so you never know. Maybe even next year. I don't know. We'll see. Anyhow, I appreciate all of you who hung in through this long conversation. It's not easy to sit here and talk for an hour about a race. Well, actually it was. It was really easy. I had a lot to cover there, and it was fun recapping it. So I appreciate anybody who listened. I hope you got something out of it. I hope that that was just more than me and my race recap. I hope there were some points of interest for you and some points that maybe will inspire you and help you. So thank you. If you're running out there this week, go out and run hard. Remember, it's the direction you're going, not at the position or where you are. So just hang in there and keep going. If you're not running this week, get out there and cheer somebody on. It was really cool at the Oxbow. Again, small group of people, but every 5 miles we got to stay and hang out a little bit with folks who were reassuring us that we're doing a good job and reassuring us with some cool snacks and food and drinks. And so go cheer somebody on. And if running is not your deal, then keep coming back. I'm glad you came to listen in today. Running is a lot like life. So even if you're not a runner, I think you can take some inspiration from these running stories and apply it over here in life. You'll have a great week. Thank you again for listening in. And until next time, you have a great week.
Despite